Hey guys, tonight we begin with a farmhouse standing alone on the Great Plains while the wind removes the outside world. Snow presses against the walls, climbs over the lower window panes, and finally covers the door. It is a cozy image only from a safe distance. Inside, a family is discovering that winter survival is not one brave act, but a chain of ordinary systems. The stove, chimney, fuel pile, water pail, food shelf, barn, and the people keeping them all working. If you enjoy quiet history built from real problems, leave a like and subscribe, and tell us where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first warning may not be the cold. It may be the sound at the door. Not a knock. Not a branch. Just a soft, heavy resistance when someone lifts the latch and tries to pull. The door moves a little, then stops. On the other side, wind has packed snow against the boards. Perhaps it reaches only the lower hinge. Perhaps it has climbed much higher. No one inside can see the shape of the drift, and that uncertainty matters. A small bank can be cleared. A deep one can collapse into the room, bury the threshold, or consume precious strength while the storm is still building. This is not one named household, and not one perfect description of every farm on the plains. It is a bounded reconstruction of a problem repeated across exposed country. A family indoors, wind-driven snow outside, and a familiar doorway becoming unreliable. On the open plains, falling snow did not need to remain where it landed. Strong wind could lift loose snow and drive it across fields until a fence, wall, bank, or building interrupted the flow. Then it accumulated unevenly. One patch of ground might be scraped nearly bare, while a nearby wall collected a drift several feet deep. During major blizzards, visibility could collapse, transport could stop, and livestock could disappear into the moving white. The danger was not simply the amount of snow, it was what the wind did with it. Inside the house, however, the first response was usually not dramatic. Someone checked the stove. Someone looked at the children. Someone counted what was already within reach. This is where the modern fantasy begins to break. We often imagine survival as a contest between a heroic person and savage weather. But a family did not defeat a blizzard. It managed a room. It protected a flame. It decided whether opening a door would help or make matters worse. It remembered how much fuel remained near the house, whether more was stored outside, whether the animals had been fed, and whether the path to the barn could still be followed. The buried door therefore announced more than inconvenience. It announced separation. The house had been connected to a larger working landscape. Fuel, hay, grain, water, animals, tools, neighbours, roads, and town all lay beyond its walls. Once the storm erased the paths between them, every ordinary task became a question of distance and risk. 10 meters could become dangerous. A barn could vanish without moving. A person could leave a worn doorway, turn in blowing snow, and lose the building directly behind them. For the moment, everyone remained inside. The room nearest the stove held the most useful heat. Chairs might be drawn closer. Doors to colder rooms might stay closed. Clothing remained layered even indoors. Wet mittens and socks needed attention, because damp material could become a serious problem on the next trip outside. The smallest children required warmth without being allowed too near the stove. Adults listened for changes, the pitch of the wind, the rattle of a loose fitting, the fall of snow from the roof, the uncertain breathing of the chimney. A warm room could create false confidence. The stove was not a metal box producing comfort without consequence. It required fuel, draft, and a clear route for smoke. If snow altered the chimney's flow, smoke might spill into the room. If every crack was sealed in fear of the cold, the air could become dangerous. If fuel burned too quickly, the warmest hours of the storm might be purchased at the cost of a colder morning. So the stove became a clock. Every stick or lump placed inside marked time being used. Every opening of the firebox admitted cold air and released heat. Every decision about which room to warm also decided which room would be surrendered to winter. The house itself shaped these choices. Some families lived in houses built partly from prairie sod, whose thick walls could slow heat loss but also bring dampness, dirt, insects, and maintenance problems. Others occupied small timber claim shacks where wind found seams around boards, windows, and roofs. Better established farms might have larger houses, yet larger space meant more air to warm and more rooms to abandon during severe cold. There was no single Great Plains home and no universal method hidden in its walls. Still, every dwelling had a threshold between shelter and exposure, and tonight that threshold had disappeared. Another door might be tested, if one existed. A window away from the main drift might offer light or information. Waiting could be wiser than digging while the wind continued packing snow against the house. An inward opening door might remain movable, but admit a mass of powder. An outward opening door could become physically pinned. Construction, storm direction, and simple luck all mattered. The important decision was not merely, can we get out? It was, must anyone go out now? If the animals had been fed and watered before the storm strengthened, waiting might preserve life. If the chimney drew properly, the stove remained stable, and food and water were inside, the door could stay buried for a time. But if fuel lay outside, livestock were unattended, smoke began to collect, or a roof showed strain, confinement could quickly become dangerous. This was the deeper system behind the title. Snow did not attack each part of the household separately. It connected them. The block door affected fuel, fuel affected heat, heat affected water, water and feed affected livestock, livestock represented food, transport, labour, money, and the future of the farm. A single drift at the entrance could therefore reach far beyond the entrance. And yet, inside that narrowing world, the work stayed ordinary. A meal still had to be prepared. Ash still had to be managed. A frightened child still needed a calm voice. A lamp wick still needed trimming. Someone still had to resist opening the door, simply to see how bad it was. Winter survival often depended on this refusal to turn discomfort into panic. Families who had lived through earlier storms understood that noise could make the weather seem larger than it was. Wind made the house creak, snow struck the glass like thrown sand, darkness arrived early inside rooms whose windows had been covered. The building seemed to shrink, not because its walls moved, but because fewer parts remained comfortable and useful. So the household gathered closer to the centre of heat. Beyond the walls, fences were disappearing line by line. The yard had lost its paths. The door was no longer an exit, but a question waiting beneath the snow. By morning, someone might have to answer it with a shovel, a rope, and a carefully chosen route. For now, survival began by staying still long enough to understand what the storm had changed. By morning, the question beneath the snow had acquired a shape. Not a neat white mound, but a sloping wall pressed against the house. The wind had spent the night lifting loose snow from the open ground, carrying it across the fields, and dropping it wherever the moving air was forced to slow. The doorway had simply stood in the wrong place. This was one of the defining winter problems of the Great Plains. The land was never truly empty, but in many settled districts, there were long exposed reaches with few trees or other obstacles to reduce the wind. When a strong winter system crossed that country, falling snow became only part of the material in motion. Snow already on the ground might be lifted again and driven onwards until the difference between earth and air nearly disappeared. A person looking through a partly uncovered window might therefore see surprisingly little snow on one stretch of yard and a great bank beside another. The storm had not distributed its burden fairly. It had sorted the snow according to wind, surface, and obstruction. The process was simple enough to describe, though difficult to live with. Moving air carries loose snow. A barrier interrupts that movement. Airflow changes around the object. losing speed in some places and accelerating in others. Where the wind slows, it can no longer carry as much snow, so the particles settle. More snow arrives. The drift then alters the airflow again, encouraging further accumulation until the wind changes. The loose snow declines, or the drift reaches a more stable form. The house was not merely being covered by snowfall from above, it was collecting snow from a much larger area. That explains why a moderate fall could create an alarming drift. The field around the farm acted like a broad white sauce. Each gust skimmed a little from its surface and delivered some of it to the first useful obstacle: a wall, fence, hedge, wagon, haystack, shed, or bank could all become places of deposition. Wind might leave exposed ground on one side and pile deep snow on the other. This is also why the word sheltered requires care. A sheltered place was calmer because an obstacle had reduced the wind. That same reduction encouraged snow to fall out of the moving air. A barrier could protect a house from direct wind while creating a drift nearby. The position of the house relative to fences, barns, shelter belts, and the storm direction mattered. Protection and burial could be two results of the same object. Later snow control practice would formalize this principle. Snow fences and planted windbreaks were placed to make drifting happen deliberately, at a chosen distance from roads, buildings, and work areas. Their value depended on orientation, density, height, and spacing. A dense barrier might create a shorter, deeper deposit. A more porous one could spread snow across a longer area. Put the barrier badly, and the drift intended to protect a building could form exactly where access was needed. Families living before such guidance still learned from repeated winters. They watched which side of the barn collected snow. They noticed where a fence line vanished first. They saw that a small outbuilding could send a tongue of drift towards a door, or that a gap between structures might funnel wind rather than stop it. Farm layout was not just a summer question of convenience. In winter, it shaped the movement of air. The snow itself mattered too. Wet, heavy snow behaved differently from cold, dry powder. Loose powder was easier for wind to lift, sometimes long after it first fell. A blizzard did not always require fresh snow descending in great quantities. Strong winds could pick up an existing surface layer and produce a ground blizzard, filling the air with old snow and rebuilding drifts people had already cleared. This meant the door could disappear more than once. A person might dig an opening in the morning, only to watch its edges soften and close while the wind continued. A path to the barn could survive for an hour and then be erased. Shoveling was not always permanent progress. During active drifting, it became a negotiation with a landscape still in motion. Near the farmhouse, each corner created its own small weather. Wind approaching a wall divided, rising over the roof and passing around the sides. Pressure increased on the exposed face. Eddies formed behind corners and in the lee of the building. Snow settled where air lost speed, but could be scoured from places where flow tightened. The result was rarely a smooth blanket. It was a set of ridges, hollows, lips, and packed faces. The doorway was vulnerable because it stood against a wall, often near steps, porches, lean-tos, or other changes in shape. These features might create useful calm in ordinary weather, yet during drifting snow they supplied edges around which air curled and deposits grew. A porch could shelter people from falling snow and still become a chamber filling from the open side. Windows told another version of the same story. One might remain clear enough to admit grey light, while another slowly darkened behind a drift. Snow pressed against the glass did not prove that the whole house was buried to that level. It showed that local airflow had chosen that wall as a place to unload. Fences also changed meaning. In summer they marked property or directed animals. In a storm they became long structures that trapped snow. The upper wire might remain visible for a while, then only the posts, then nothing at all. The disappearing fence removed a landmark that might later guide a journey to the barn or road. Yet the buried line could survive in memory. People familiar with the farm knew where it ran, even when they could not see it. Later, that knowledge might be combined with a rope or direct hand contact to reduce the danger of losing direction. For now, the problem remained at the door. Snow entering around the threshold was cleared. The lower boards were checked for bending. The temptation was to imagine the drift as a pile that could be attacked from the warm side, but opening into a high bank might release snow into the room, expose the interior to the wind, or leave the door impossible to close again. The safer choice depended on conditions that could not all be seen. Was the drift soft or packed? Did it rise above the latch? Was another exit on the lee side clearer? Had the wind begun to ease? Or was this only a pause between gusts? The buried doorway was the visible result of an invisible system. Open ground supplied the snow. Wind transported it. Buildings and fences redirected the air. Corners slowed it. The new drift reshaped the next gust. By the time resistance appeared at the latch, the process had been working across the farm for hours. And it was still working. Beyond the wall, fine snow continued to travel close to the ground. It crossed the exposed field, reached the farmhouse, rose along the boards, and dropped into the growing bank. The house stood firm, but the usable world around it was changing metre by metre. Before anyone could decide how to leave, they would need to understand what kind of shelter held them, and what weaknesses the wind had found in its walls. The wind had found the walls long before the drift was understood. A farmhouse on the Great Plains was never just a background to Wintert's materials. Size, position, roof, openings and state of repair decided how quickly heat escaped, where snow collected, how smoke left, and whether there was another usable way out. When the main door vanished, the house revealed what kind of bargain its builders had made with the land. For some early homesteaders, that bargain began with earth. Where timber was scarce or expensive, families cut thick blocks from the tough prairie sod and stacked them into walls. Grass roots held the soil together well enough to create heavy courses, sometimes several feet thick. Such walls could slow the movement of heat far better than a thin shell of poorly fitted boards. In hard winter weather, the sod house could feel surprisingly steady. The wind might roar over the roof while the earthen walls remained solid and quiet. But warmth was only one part of shelter. A sod house was heavy. Its roof might be built from poles, brush, hay, boards when available, and layers of earth. That mass could shelter the room below, but it also demanded maintenance. Rain found weak places, soil sifted down, insects and small animals occasionally treated the structure as familiar ground, which, from their point of view, it was. The interior might be dim because glass was expensive and windows were small. Fewer or smaller openings reduced heat loss. Yet they also reduced daylight, ventilation, and possible escape routes. When snow covered the door, a thick wall did not automatically provide another exit. It merely gave the household more time to think. The dugout made an even closer alliance with the earth. Instead of building every wall upward, a settler could cut a rectangular room into a slope or bank, then close the exposed front with sod, stone, logs or scrap lumber. The earth formed three sides. A roof of poles and layered material covered the top. Properly placed, such a dwelling was inexpensive, relatively quick to make, cool in summer, and warmer in winter than its rough appearance suggested. Its position could also be chosen with winter in mind. Historical descriptions from Nebraska recommended an east-facing front on the side of a hill, where the entrance could receive morning light and the north wind might sweep snow away rather than pack it directly against the door. That was the ideal. The actual results depended on the hill, wind, roof, drainage, and care of construction. The door and perhaps the only window were often concentrated in the exposed front wall. If snow sealed that face, the family could lose most of its light and movement at once. If meltwater entered, the earth that protected the household from cold could help hold moisture around it. A roof partly covered by soil might blend gently into the landscape, but the people beneath it still had to watch for leaks, sagging, and the added burden of drifting snow. A dugout could be warm without being comfortable. It could be secure without being generous, and if its single front opening failed, the room could feel less like a house than a pocket cut into the frozen ground. The claim shack made a different compromise. A newcomer with limited money and urgent legal or practical reasons to establish residence might put up a small frame structure as quickly as materials allowed. Thin boards created walls, tar paper, battens, plaster, cloth, newspaper or other available materials might later reduce drafts. The little building stood clearly above the prairie, easier to light through windows and easier to enlarge than a hole in a bank. Yet every joint invited inspection by the wind. Cold air pressed through gaps around boards, doors, windows, floors, and roof edges. Snow dust could enter through openings too small to notice in calm weather. A stove might make the centre of the room hot while the edges remained bitterly cold. Water near an outside wall could freeze while someone sitting close to the fire felt overheated. The household did not live in one temperature. It lived in several narrow climates arranged around the stove. The small size of the shack was both hardship and advantage. There was little space for privacy, storage, or escape from smoke, but there was also less air to warm. Beds, table, chairs, food, tools, wet clothing, and people crowded together because the same compact room had to serve nearly every domestic purpose. A larger timber farmhouse could look like progress, and often it was. Better construction might provide fitted windows, separate rooms, a proper kitchen, an upper floor, storage, and more than one exterior opening. A second door on another side of the building could remain accessible when the first collected adrift. Unused rooms could be closed while everyone gathered near the main stove. But size created new demands. More walls meant more seams. More windows meant more cold surfaces. More rooms required decisions about which spaces deserved heat. An upper floor might hold sleeping rooms that became painfully cold, while warm air rising from below carried household moisture towards roofs and windows. Additions, porches, summer kitchens, and lean-tos changed the wind around the building and created new places for snow to gather. Even prosperity could produce a more complicated winter machine. People inside a buried house therefore needed to understand its structure almost as well as a sailor understood a vessel. Which wall faced the strongest wind? Which window usually drifted over first? Where did the chimney pass through the roof? Which door opened inward? Which room stayed warm longest? Was there an attic, cellar, lean-to, or connecting passage? Could a window be opened without admitting a bank of snow? Was the roof making its usual sounds, or had the load changed them? These were not architectural questions in the modern professional sense. They were household knowledge accumulated through repair, discomfort, and repetition. Class shaped that knowledge because class shapes the building. A well-established farmer could afford lumber, glass, metal hardware, insulation improvements, and perhaps hired help. A poorer family might depend on reused boards, an aging stove, a damaged roof, and fuel stacked further from the house because there was no better place. Some immigrant families brought construction traditions suited to other climates and adapted them to the plains. Other settlers learned from neighbours, local builders, previous occupants, or painful experience. No single house type guaranteed survival, and none deserves romantic treatment. Sod walls could conserve heat but limit light and openings. Dugouts could use the earth's protection but concentrate access at one exposed face. Small frame shacks could be dry and quick to build, but lose heat through every imperfect seam. Larger houses could offer alternate rooms and doors while demanding more fuel and maintenance. The best shelter was not necessarily the strongest looking one. It was the house whose weaknesses were known. As the darkened window and pressure at the door were studied, the building stopped being a simple container. It became a map of possible movement. The walls that held back wind also limited choices. The roof preserving warmth might offer the only route above the drift. A window made for light might become an emergency opening. A loft used for storage might lead to the outside world. The next problem was no longer why the snow had gathered. It was how to leave without allowing winter to enter first. The wall had become a map, and now one line on that map had to lead outside. The main door was no longer the obvious answer. Snow held it fast, and the storm might still be adding more. Opening it carelessly could bring the drift into the room. solving one problem by creating several others. The least dramatic option came first. Wait. That could be the wisest choice while the stove drew cleanly. Food and water remained available. The animals had recently been attended, and the building showed no immediate danger. Great Plains blizzards punished movement. Shelter, even poor shelter, was often safer than entering a whiteout without a fixed route. A blocked door felt urgent, but discomfort was not the same as necessity. The wind was listened to rather than trusted. A brief lull did not mean the storm had ended. Snow could continue moving close to the ground after fresh snowfall weakened. A cleared opening might fill again before a person returned. The real question was not whether someone could force a way out for a few minutes, but whether the route would remain usable long enough to complete the task and come back. Information had to come before effort. A window on another wall might show whether the drift was local. Frost could be scraped from the glass. Brightness suggested that part of the opening remained exposed. Darkness might mean snow, cloud, shade, or only a heavy skin of ice. No single sign was perfect, but several signs together reduced guesswork. A window could also become an exit. This was not merely a convenient reconstruction. During the Northern Plains blizzard of 1966, reports described houses with snow packed so high before their doors that occupants had to climb through windows or wait for people outside to dig them free. At Sebastian Crumb's farm near Hague, North Dakota, the drift reached the rooftop. When the roof began to crack, he braced it with household furniture and shoveled snow from the roof into the attic to make a way out. That was one building, one storm, and one desperate arrangement of roof, tools, furniture, and snow. It should not become a universal frontier technique. Its value is narrower. A buried door forced people to reconsider every opening and every structural weakness in the house. The window, attic, or roof was not automatically safer. It was simply the route the drift had not yet removed. Sometimes that route remained unused because waiting still offered the smaller risk. Before opening a lower window, bedding, clothing, lamps, and food could be moved away from the sill. Loose snow might spill inward. A sash swollen by damp or frozen at the edges could resist as firmly as the door. The first person through needed proper layers, mittens, and a useful tool. A shovel was valuable only if it fitted through the opening. A smaller scoop, board, pan, or cooking vessel might begin the work until a larger tool could be reached. There was an awkward dignity to such an escape. An adult climbed over a sill, turned sideways, lowered into snow, and tried not to tear clothing on the frame. A child might pass out tools. Someone inside held the first person steady. The window had been designed for light and air. Winter had promoted it without consultation. Once outside, the purpose was not to clear the farm. It was to restore one safe connection. Snow might be removed from the main entrance from outside, far enough away that it would not fall back. Loose powder flowed like dry sand. Wind-packed drift came away in heavy blocks. A narrow trench could collapse or refill, and hard shoveling could leave a worker sweating beneath winter clothing. That warmth was deceptive. Damp inner layers became dangerous when the work stopped. Mittens stiffened. Wet cloth lost comfort. A person who had felt almost hot could cool rapidly in the wind. Clearing, therefore, had to be paced, and workers rotated when the household had enough capable people to do so. A rope kept the first journey bounded. One end remained secured inside or around the building. The person outside held the line while moving along the wall. It might snag or disappear beneath fresh snow, but it preserved a physical connection when vision failed. Higher levels offered other possibilities. In some houses, an attic or loft might place a person above the deepest part of the drift. In a larger farmhouse, an upper window could provide access to a porch roof or to snow that had risen near the second story. Yet the wind was stronger above the shelter of the wall. Snow concealed roof edges. Ice turned a short crawl into a full risk. Many early houses had no safe internal route to the roof. Sod and dugout roofs were layered structures not meant to be opened casually. Cutting through could weaken the shelter or admit snow. A frame farmhouse with attic access offered more choices, but only if its construction, tools, and occupants allowed them. Real decisions were rarely as neat as later storytelling. The safest opening might be too small for one person. The strongest adult might be ill or away. A clear upper window could open above a dangerous drop. A route possible in a timber farmhouse might be useless in a dugout. Poor households often had fewer openings, weaker tools, and less spare clothing to absorb wet work. Even the main door demanded judgment. Pushing hard from inside could damage hinges or latch hardware. Clearing only the lower half from outside might leave a heavy overhang. When the door opened, snow could fall over the worker or into the room. The method depended on whether the drift was soft, packed, crusted, or layered with ice. The house was treated as a sequence of tests rather than an enemy to be conquered. The door gave one answer. The windows gave another. The sheltered wall suggested a route. Clothing, tools, and rope were prepared before anyone crossed the threshold. At last, a shovel might strike the outer boards. A muffled sound passed through the door. A hand inside pressed against the wood in reply. The distance between the two people was no more than the thickness of the drift, yet for a few minutes they occupied different worlds. Then the latch moved. Cold air entered first, followed by a blade of white light. The household had recovered a doorway, but not freedom. Beyond it waited the next calculation. How much warmth could be spent, how much fuel remained, and how long the stove could keep the reclaimed opening from becoming useless again. Cold air entered through the recovered doorway, but no one could afford to admire the opening for long. The room had already begun to change. Warm air moved towards the gap. Fine snow skittered over the threshold. The stove, which had seemed steady only moments earlier, now had to replace heat escaping into the yard. The door was pulled shut as soon as the shovel and worker were safely inside. The latch caught. Cloth returned near the worst drafts, and everyone gathered once more around the iron centre of the winter world. A fire did not simply make a house warm. It consumed a stored future. Every piece of wood, twist of prairie grass, lump of coal, corn cob, or dried buffalo chip represented labour completed before the storm. It had been cut, gathered, bought, hauled, dried, stacked, and protected. Once the route to the fuel pile became uncertain, the supply already indoors acquired a new value. A stick was no longer merely a stick. It was a measured portion of the night. Fuel varied across the plains because landscape and household purse varied. Families near creeks, wooded ground, or planted groves might burn wood. Others bought coal when transport and money allowed. Where timber was scarce and coal too expensive, people used what prairie and farm could provide. Birdie MacDonald remembered how her South Dakota family managed this problem. On stormy days, her father and two older brothers took turns in a small sod annex, twisting coarse slaff grass that had been cut and stacked during summer. They packed the grass into iron drums and fed it through openings in the cooking stove. There was no nearby wood, she recalled, and coal cost more than the family could afford. In warmer months, the older children gathered buffalo chips for cooking fires. That memory belongs to one household, but it shows how heat began long before a match was struck. Fuel could be a crop of labour in its own right. The stove revealed differences between homes immediately. A cast-iron cooking stove could heat the room, boil water, dry clothing, warm food, and support nearly every domestic task. Yet it was not automatic. Someone had to understand its drafts, lids, dampers, ash, and appetite. A hot, clean-burning fire required air. Too much air sent heat rapidly up the chimney. Too little produced poor combustion, smoke, and a weak fire that seemed to consume fuel without properly warming the room. Three demands had to be held together. Heat needed to remain indoors. Smoke and combustion gases needed to leave. Fresh air had to enter so the fire could draw. The chimney made that balance possible when it was sound and clear. Hot gases rising through the flue helped pull air into the stove. Winter could interfere. Wind around the roof changed pressure near the chimney top. Snow or debris could obstruct an outlet. A damaged joint leaked. A cold or poorly drawing flue allowed smoke to spill back when the stove door opened. People did not need modern technical language to recognize bad draft. Smoke curled into the room. Eyes watered. Soot appeared where it should not. A flame behaved differently. Clothing and bedding carried the smell. One serious danger offered no useful smell at all. Carbon monoxide is produced by incomplete combustion and can build when fuel-burning equipment or its venting fails. Families of the period had no household alarms. Their safety depended on the stove and chimney, the behaviour of the fire, and air moving through a building they were simultaneously trying to keep warm. Perfect sealing was therefore not a victory over cold. A draught through a cracked frame wall was uncomfortable and wasteful, but some air exchange helped the stove operate and diluted smoke. The fiercest leaks could be blocked without pretending that a room containing a fire should become airtight. The goal was controlled warmth, not complete closure. The heated world could also be made smaller. Doors to spare rooms stayed shut. Bedding moved nearer the stove. Children might sleep in the main room rather than in separate spaces. Water vessels, food likely to freeze, wet outer clothing, and necessary tools were gathered into the useful zone. Beyond it, the house cooled in stages. The far side of the room felt different from the stove side. A bedroom became a place entered quickly. Frost thickened on glass. Water near an outside wall began to ice, while a kettle beside the fire steamed. The household was not heating a house evenly. It was defending a shrinking island. That concentration created new inconveniences. Wet mittens crowded the warmest drying places. Boots could harden if left cold. Yet intense heat could damage leather. Bedding had to remain safely away from sparks and hot metal. Children required watching. Ash needed removal, but warm embers could not be handled carelessly inside a confined home. Then there was time. A large fire provided quick comfort and consumed the reserve. A smaller fire preserved fuel, but might fail to dry clothing or protect vulnerable people. Letting the stove fall too low overnight meant rebuilding the fire in a cold room with stiff fingers. Packing in more fuel did not guarantee a clean, efficient, or safe burn. The person tending the stove learned the household rhythm. Fuel was added before the room fell too far. Cooking happened while heat was already strong. Water warmed at the same time. Only clothing needed for the next journey claimed the best drying space. Some reserve remained beyond the apparent end of the storm. That last rule was difficult because the apparent end could mislead. Wind eased and rose again. A path cleared in daylight closed by evening. Roads stayed blocked after the sky cleared. Fuel stored a short distance from the house remained inaccessible without more digging. Preparation determined the margin. Good wood had been cut and dried before winter. Grass or other substitute fuel had been gathered while the ground was open. Coal had been purchased before transport failed. A small indoor reserve prevented the first buried door from becoming an immediate heating crisis. Preparation had limits. Poor families could not store what they could not afford. A weak harvest reduced crop residue. A long winter exhausted careful reserves. Illness reduced the labour available to feed and clean the stove. A damaged chimney did not repair itself because a household had been sensible in October. For the moment, the fire continued to draw. The main room held its warmth. Another portion of the day had been purchased with fuel, and with space quietly surrendered elsewhere in the house. On top of the iron, a vessel began to warm. Heat had been preserved, but preserving it created the next demand. Every drink, meal, washed hand, and tended animal required water, and outside the walls the well had disappeared beneath the same white distance as the barn. The well had not moved, but the storm had made it distant. On an ordinary morning, water came from a route known by feel. A pail went to the pump or well. A child might be sent to a cistern. In some places, the supply came from a spring, creek, storage barrel, or wind-powered pump. The task was repetitive, heavy, and so familiar that it could become almost invisible. Now the yard had lost its paths. A well, only a short distance from the door, had become a problem of exposure and direction. The pump handle might be frozen. A cover could lie beneath a drift. The cleared doorway might close while someone worked. Even if the source remained sound, reaching it could cost more heat and strength than the household wished to spend. The first water counted was therefore the water already inside. Buckets, kettles, crocks, pitchers, and wash basins formed a small domestic inventory. Some held drinking water. Some were intended for cooking. Some had already served another purpose. A household without indoor plumbing understood water as something carried, placed, guarded, and sometimes reused where sensible. The storm did not invent that discipline. It made the discipline urgent. A pail near the stove was checked. Vessels were covered against ash and dust. Children were reminded that a cup drawn casually now belonged to a supply no one could easily replace. The amount indoors had to serve several needs. People drank flour, beans, porridge, coffee, tea, soup, and other foods required different quantities. Hands, utensils, cloths, babies, and illness created further demands. Every ordinary use competed with the possibility that no one would reach the well that day. Storage offered the quietest protection. Water systems differed from farm to farm. Some households depended on hand-dug or drilled wells. Others used cisterns, springs, creeks, barrels, or carried supplies. What mattered during the storm was not merely the presence of water somewhere on the property. A person had to reach it, and the equipment had to keep working. Containers filled before the wind strengthened purchase time. Even one covered pail beside the stove could postpone a dangerous trip. When they were not enough, winter appeared to offer an answer against every wall. Snow was water, but not yet useful water. A large pot filled with loose powder melted into a disappointingly shallow pool. Snow contained a great deal of air, and its water content varied. Dry powder occupied much space while producing little liquid. Wet or wind-packed snow yielded more but was heavier to gather. The same vessel might be refilled several times before producing enough water for a meal. Every refill spent fuel. Snow placed on the stove absorbed heat that might otherwise warm the room. Dry clothing or cook food. Wood, coal, grass, cobs, dung, or crop residue was being converted into water. During prolonged isolation, that exchange became severe. Snow looked limitless outside. Fuel was not. Collecting it also reopened the household to the weather. Someone had to go out or reach through the newly cleared door or window. Each load returned with powder on sleeves and boots. Snow spilled over the floor and became water where no one wanted it. Wet boards, damp stockings, and an icy threshold added labour to the simple act of filling a pot. The source was abundant. Bringing it inside still carried a price. The cleanest-looking drift was not necessarily clean. Wind carried soil and organic material. Snow near a chimney collected soot or ash. Material beside a barn, animal yard, privy, roof edge, or travelled path could contain contamination invisible after melting. White colour was not proof of purity. Households did not share one modern understanding of water treatment, and the script should not pretend that they did. Decisions reflected observation, custom, available fuel, and necessity. Water used in soup, porridge, tea, or coffee would be heated during preparation, but not every family deliberately purified every vessel. Obvious risks could still be avoided. Snow was gathered away from animals, waste, roof runoff, and chimney fall. A cleaner-looking layer was chosen rather than scraping directly from the ground. A clean vessel helped. Meltwater could rest briefly, so visible grit settled. These choices did not guarantee safety. They show only that obtaining water required judgment, not merely a scoop. Children could help with smaller vessels, though this shifted rather than removed the burden. Adults lifted heavy pots and controlled the stove. The work looked gentle beside digging through a drift, yet it continued without much reward. Fill, melt, settle, Pour. Refill. The kettle that had warmed so peacefully now revealed a chain of labour. Stored water had weaknesses too. A pail near an outside wall began to freeze. Ice had to be broken without damaging the container. Water carried into a colder room became unusable until warmed. A pump outside might freeze while drifting snow gathered around the well cover. Water needed to remain close enough to the stove to stay liquid, but not where a boot, child, or hurried elbow could knock it over. A spill was not a small annoyance. It meant lost drinking water, a wet floor, more indoor dampness, and perhaps clothing soaked during the cleaning. In a heated modern house, a dropped pail is inconvenient. In a snowbound room where every litre has been carried or melted, it is an event. The storm changed water's rhythm. Fuel could be counted by pieces. Food could be seen on shelves. Water was less stable. It was consumed, evaporated, frozen, spilled, absorbed, and transformed through cooking. The household had to keep producing it without filling the room with more moisture than cold walls could hold. Steam met the windows. Droplets formed and froze along their edges. Frost thickened where warm, damp air touched chilled glass. By afternoon, a careful cycle had emerged. Drinking water remained covered, a separate vessel supplied cooking, meltwater cooled away from the hottest part of the stove. Washing was reduced to what health and dignity required. Water still reasonably clean after one task might serve another less sensitive purpose. This was allocation, not comfort. It also exposed the difference between preparation and desperation. A protected cistern, reliable pump, or generous stored supply created a wider margin. A distant well, weak containers, scarce fuel, or one able-bodied carrier created a narrow one. The same storm surrounded both houses. It did not give them the same chance. Inside, the kettle gave a small sound as the water reached heat. It would soon soften flour, beans, or grain and turn stored ingredients into a meal. The next pressure was waiting quietly on the shelves. The water became useful only when it met something from the shelf. A handful of beans, a measure of flour, a piece of cured meat, or a few potatoes could turn warm liquid into food. But the storm had changed the meaning of every ingredient. A meal was no longer chosen only for taste or habit. It was a decision about how much fuel, water, time, and stored food to spend at once. The pantry was another form of winter architecture. Its shelves, sacks, jars, crocks, bins and hooks held the results of earlier seasons. Grain had been harvested, purchased, or taken to a mill. Vegetables had been lifted before the ground froze. Fruit had been dried or preserved. Meat had been butchered, salted, smoked, dried, or kept cold according to household practice and available facilities. Fat had been rendered, beans and peas had been dried. Some families entered winter with canned goods. Others relied more heavily on sacks, barrels, crocks, cellars, and smokehouses. These stores varied as sharply as the houses around them. An established farm with a productive garden, healthy animals, a sound cellar, and money for flour, sugar, coffee, salt, or canned goods possessed a wider margin. A new claimant after a weak harvest might have little beyond meal, flour, beans, potatoes, salt pork, and whatever could be bought before the roads closed. A household could own land and still be short of food. A full-looking farm did not guarantee full shelves. When snow covered the door, the most valuable food was often the food already warm enough to reach. Supplies in an outdoor cellar, smokehouse, granary, or storage shed might be perfectly preserved and temporarily inaccessible. A root cellar protected potatoes, turnips, carrots, cabbage, and similar produce from severe temperature changes, but only if someone could reach its entrance. Meat hanging in a separate building was useful only after a safe route had been made. The storm had not destroyed those supplies. It had separated them from the stove. That made the kitchen stores disproportionately important. Flour and meal could become bread, biscuits, dumplings, porridge, or thickening. Dried beans kept well but demanded water, fuel, and time. Potatoes and root vegetables offered substance with less preparation, provided they had not frozen or spoiled. Salted or smoked meat brought flavour, fat, and protein, though it could increase thirst and had to be used with regard to what remained. A sensible meal joined ingredients rather than spending them separately. One pot reduced washing. Soup or stew used water as both cooking medium and part of the meal. Beans, grain, vegetables, and a little meat produced more servings than the meat alone. A kettle already heated for drinking could help begin the next dish. This was household arithmetic rather than a picturesque frontier recipe. Severe rationing did not necessarily begin at once. Cutting portions too early could weaken people who still had to shovel, carry fuel, tend the stove, and reach livestock. The first task was to prevent waste and estimate duration. How much food was inside the house? What remained in the cellar or smokehouse? When had the animals last been fed? Was the wind weakening or merely changing direction? Could neighbours or a road crew reach the farm after the storm? No answer was certain. Breakfast became modest rather than desperate. Flour was measured carefully, and excess returned to the sack. Crumbs were kept. Fat left in a pan could flavour another dish. A heel of bread too hard to eat comfortably softened in soup. Bones contributed to broth. Leftovers were covered and placed where they would remain cool without freezing solid. Preservation did not end when winter arrived. It continued inside the room. Heat from the stove could spoil food placed too close. Cold at an outside wall could freeze it. Damp encouraged mould. Mice required no invitation to inspect a grain sack. A cracked jar, loose lid, spoiled potato, or uncertain piece of meat had to be noticed before it damaged more valuable stores. The pantry demanded attention, while the storm demanded attention elsewhere. Historical farm diets were neither uniform nor ideal. What appeared on the table depended on region, culture, income, season, harvest, livestock, market access, and the labour available for preservation. Fresh produce narrowed during winter. Repetition increased. Beans, grain, potatoes, preserved vegetables, dried fruit, cured meat, lard, molasses, coffee, and other durable foods might dominate one household, while another ate a different combination. Canning belongs carefully in the timeline. Home preservation in sealed jars expanded during the 19th century and became increasingly important. But access to jars, lids, sugar, equipment, and sufficient produce differed. A shelf of colourful jars should not be placed automatically in every sod house or claim shack. The same caution applies to abundance. Stories of heavy tables can obscure lean years. Drought, crop failure, insects, livestock disease, debt, transport disruption, and poverty reduced winter stores before the first blizzard arrived. The storm then exposed an old shortage rather than creating a new one. Children noticed changes in meals even when adults tried to make them ordinary. There might be less sweetening. Coffee could be weaker or reserved for adults. Meat appeared as small pieces through a dish rather than as a portion for each person. A familiar treat was postponed because no one knew when the road would open. Humour sometimes lived in these adjustments, but hunger did not become amusing merely because a family spoke lightly about it. A parent could make a small meal feel deliberate while privately calculating how many remained. Cooking itself consumed the resources already under pressure. Long boiling beans used fuel unless soaked first. Baking required sustained, controlled heat. Frying spent fat and demanded attention. Every lid lifted from a pot released warmth and steam. The most efficient dish was not always the most desired one, and comfort had value during confinement. A warm drink or familiar bread could settle a frightened child, reward someone returning from the drift, and make the room feel like a home rather than an emergency station. That emotional value had to be earned without consuming tomorrow's security. By evening, the system was clearer. Water made stored food edible. Fuel made water and food hot. The house protected fuel, stove, and people. Labour connected them. No single shelf saved the household. Survival came from keeping each part from exhausting the others. Then a sound reached the room from beyond the walls. Not the wind this time. Perhaps it was the dull movement of an animal in the barn, or only the family imagining it because livestock had been absent from every calculation for too long. Flour could be rationed, beans could wait. The animals could not open a feed bin, break ice in a trough, or clear snow from their own air. The next meal inside depended, in part, on lives waiting outside. The animals could not wait for the household to feel ready. A cow did not understand that the door had disappeared. Horses still needed feed and water. Chickens crowded together against the cold. Pigs rooted through bedding that was becoming damp. Beyond the farmhouse walls, living creatures were spending energy simply to remain warm, and every hour without care reduced the margin available to them. The barn had become the centre of the next calculation. For a Great Plains family, livestock were not separate from household survival. A team of horses or oxen supplied power for field work and transport. A milk cow provided food. Chickens produced eggs when conditions allowed. Pigs, cattle, and other animals represented meat, income, breeding stock, debt, and months or years of labour. Losing them could weaken a farm long after snow melted. Reaching them meant opening the small island of warmth defended through the night. The first journey began before the door opened. Clothing had to be dry enough to protect the person going out. Mittens, boots, cap, scarf, coat, and outer layers were checked. A shovel might be required immediately. Feed could be carried only after a path existed. The task had to be clear before cold and wind complicated thought. The aim was rarely to make the barn comfortable. It was to keep the animals alive. Feed came first because cold increased the energy animals used. Hay, grain, fodder, or crop residue had to be available, dry enough to eat and close enough to reach. A barn might contain stored hay above or beside the animals, reducing repeated crossings. On another farm, the main stack stood outdoors, separated from the barn by only a few meters that now felt much longer. A stack partly covered by drift could still hold usable feed beneath the surface. Uncovering it consumed strength. Wind tore loose hay from a worker's arms, snow entered sleeves and boot tops. A load light in calm weather became awkward when carried against a gust. Inside the barn, the air felt different from the house. It was warmer than the open yard because bodies, walls, bedding and shelter reduced exposure, yet warmth did not prove safety. Animals released moisture through breathing and manure. Damp bedding chilled them. Poor air accumulated humidity and harmful gases. A tightly closed barn preserved heat while becoming unhealthy, especially when snow blocked openings intended for fresh air or exhaust. The same contradiction had appeared around the stove. Shelter had to hold warmth without becoming sealed. A person entering listened before seeing clearly. A horse shifting weight. A cow pulling against a tether. Hooves scraping boards. Chickens murmuring on a roost. Unusual silence could be as troubling as noise. Then came a quick inspection. Were the animals standing? Had any become tangled? Was bedding dry enough? Had wind driven snow through a crack? Were vents or windows blocked? Was the roof holding its load? No one conducted a perfect examination while the storm continued. The work depended on familiarity. Someone who fed the animals daily knew the ordinary sounds of the barn and noticed when one was wrong. Water created the hardest demand. A full-grown animal required far more than the household kettle could provide. Troughs and buckets froze. A pump might be inaccessible. Breaking ice restored access only briefly. Carrying water from the house was slow, heavy, and costly because fuel had already been spent melting or warming it. Snow could not simply replace drinking water without consequence. An animal eating snow used body heat to melt it, and not every animal consumed enough. Clean liquid water remained better when it could be supplied. During isolation, households worked with protected buckets, warmed water, broken ice, nearby wells, stored supplies, and whatever routes remained open. The labour multiplied. One trip to inspect the barn became another for feed. Another followed for water. A final journey might be required because an animal had knocked over what was carried in. Each opening of the farmhouse door admitted cold. Each return brought wet snow inside. Every crossing used human energy that could not be restored easily from a reduced pantry. Someone had to decide who could go, who must remain with children and stove, and how often the animals truly needed attention. Older children sometimes helped with routine farm work, but a blizzard changed acceptable risk. A child capable of carrying a pail in clear weather could become disoriented in a whiteout. An adult might still need assistance, yet sending 2 people outside placed 2 people in danger. The safest arrangement depended on the farm. Some barns stood close enough to reach along a wall, others had been placed farther away for reasons of space, smell, fire risk, drainage, or earlier building decisions. A connecting shed or covered passage became extraordinarily valuable. A farmyard convenient in summer might prove badly exposed in winter. Animals also differed in what they could endure. Horses and cattle could tolerate cold when healthy, well-fed, dry, and protected from wind. But wet coats, poor feed, exhaustion, age, illness, or injury narrowed that tolerance. Young animals were especially vulnerable. Chickens crowded together for warmth, though moisture and poor ventilation remained dangerous. Pigs needed dry bedding and shelter from wind. No single barn routine served every species. Nor did every family possess a substantial barn. A prosperous operation might have stored hay, divided stalls, and several workers. A new homesteader might rely on a rough shed, sod stable, dugout shelter, or windbreak. Some animals remained outdoors with access to hay and natural or built protection. A severe storm exposed every weakness in fencing, roof, feed storage, and labour. The peaceful image of a snow-covered farm was most misleading here. The white yard concealed urgency. A drift blocked a barn door. Snow sealed a low opening. Animals packed together could injure one another. A roof already carrying weight gathered more in an uneven bank. Feed existed on the property and remained unreachable. People herd livestock and still stood separated from them by weather. Choices carried consequences beyond compassion. Opening the barn widely to clear snow improved access but released warmth. Closing it tightly conserved heat but reduced air movement. Using household fuel to warm water protected animals while shortening the reserve beside the stove. Spending an hour outside might save a cow and leave the worker exhausted and wet. There was no clean line between human and animal survival. The farm operated as one body. Animals converted feed into power, food, manure, offspring, and income. People supplied shelter, water, and care. The storm tightened every connection until a failure in one part threatened the others. By the time the worker returned, ice had formed on outer clothing. Snow clung to the folds of the coat. The door closed quickly, and the room seemed almost painfully warm. The animals had fed for the moment. Their water had been checked. The barn still stood. But the crossing had revealed something more frightening than distance. Familiar space had lost its direction. On the next journey, memory and courage would not be enough. The distance had not changed. Only the certainty had gone. Between farmhouse and barn lay a yard crossed hundreds of times. In summer, a person could walk it carrying 2 pails while thinking about something else. In a blizzard, those same few meters became a white space without edges. Snow erased the path. Wind erased footprints almost as soon as they formed. The barn appeared and disappeared behind moving curtains. Turning the body slightly could make the farmhouse vanish. Once that happened, instinct became unreliable. A person might believe they were walking towards a wall while drifting past it at an angle. Surviving accounts make the loss of distance painfully clear. During the January 1888 blizzard, George Duenberger had taken his horses to a well about half a mile from his Falk County homestead. The storm erased the trail, and even the horses' heads vanished in driven snow. After reaching the barn, he found the house because his wife repeatedly blew a trumpet into the wind. At another South Dakota sod house, Sadie Shaw tried to reach a coal box only about 1 rod away. Wind knocked her down. From the window, she sometimes could not see 3 feet into the yard. Birdie MacDonald remembered a different answer. Her father tied a clothesline to one corner of the sod house and carried the other end to the sod barn. He and the older boys used that physical connection while caring for milk cows and oxen. These households did not share one story, but the mechanism was the same. Familiar sight had failed. Survival required replacing it with sound, touch, or a fixed line. A later Northern Plains storm showed how little room existed for error. In 1966, a 6-year-old became separated from her brothers between a house and barn, only 60 feet apart. Another child disappeared after walking roughly 100 feet to close a chicken coop door. The yard did not need to be large. It only needed to become invisible. A rope was one practical answer. Stretched between strong points at house and barn, it could be held while the buildings disappeared. The line needed to remain low enough to reach without raising the arms into the wind. A loose rope vanished beneath fresh snow. A weak knot or rotten section could fail. Machinery, sharp corners and gates created places for it to snag. Where no permanent line existed, a shorter length could be secured at the doorway and carried out. That allowed only a bounded journey, and limitation was its value. The traveller could not wander farther than the rope permitted. A rope did not make the weather safe. It removed one route to disaster, while leaving cold, exhaustion, and falling snow exactly where they had been. Fences offered another form of contact. A gloved hand on a post or wire preserved direction when the next building could not be seen. Each post confirmed that the route remained correct. The fence had already organised the farm in ordinary weather. During the storm, it became a crude navigation system. Yet fences disappeared too. Drifts covered lower wires. Snow softened the shape of posts. Gates became difficult to identify. Broken sections led the hand into empty space. Barbed wire could cut through stiff gloves. A person had to know the line well enough to recognize its turns and openings. Walls were more dependable while they lasted. One hand against boards, sod, or stone gave direction and sometimes partial shelter. Corners brought sudden gusts and swirling snow, but they also marked known points in the route. Even touch required interpretation. Was this the correct corner? Was the shape beneath the glove a door frame, a window edge, or only packed snow? Had a drift raised the ground so familiar features now sat lower than expected? The storm rearranged height as well as distance. A fence that usually reached the waist barely rose above snow. A window appeared near the knees or vanished entirely. Steps became slopes. Ditches filled. Banks formed across flat ground. Sound could help and mislead. A cow moving in the barn offered direction. A trumpet, bell, call, or struck pan might mark the house. Yet wind scattered sound, made it seem closer, or shifted its apparent direction. Shouting consumed breath and exposed the face. Sound worked best as confirmation rather than the only guide. Light had similar limits. A lamp in a window helped when visibility allowed. A lantern near a barn door marked a destination. Blowing snow swallowed the glow within a few meters, while frost and daylight glare weakened it further. The safest route therefore used layers. Rope supplied touch. A wall supplied position. A fence supplied direction. Light and sound supplied confirmation. No single method carried the entire burden. Journeys also needed a clear point of retreat. When a rope ended unexpectedly, a known line was recovered rather than replaced by guessing. When the barn wall did not appear where expected, widening circles only increased danger. Wet clothing, numb hands, or strengthening wind could make the unfinished task less dangerous than continuing. That was discipline rather than cowardice. People become lost in severe weather, partly because they continue after the first sign that a route has failed. Each additional step feels small. Turning back feels like wasted effort. In a whiteout, a small error grows quietly while the body spends heat and the mind tries to repair a direction it can no longer prove. Planning began indoors. The task, route, essential tool, expected duration, and signal of arrival were decided before the door opened. Clothing was fully fastened. Loads were kept small enough to leave one hand free. Speed mattered less than continuous contact with the guide. At the threshold, the change was immediate. Inside, the room had shape, sound, and warm light. Outside, wind removed all three. A hand found the rope. The farmhouse disappeared behind almost at once. Snow struck the face. Boots sank unevenly. A drift forced the knees higher than expected. There was no visible destination now. Only the next section of line. That was how the yard became survivable again. Sight was not restored. It was replaced by contact. One dangerous crossing became a sequence of small, confirmed movements. At last, a glove met the knot beside the barn. A wall emerged from the white. The door was found. The route had worked because someone inside had chosen it, secured it, held its other end, prepared the clothing, and remained ready if the traveller failed to return. The storm had made every hand useful. It had also made every assignment costly. Inside the farmhouse, work could no longer be divided by habit alone. Ordinary patterns still mattered, but the blizzard forced new questions. Who was strongest? Who was warmest? Who knew the barn best? Who could be spared from the stove? Who had already become too tired for another journey? A family was not a small military unit waiting for winter orders. It carried old habits, affection, quarrels, expectations, illness, fear, and uneven knowledge into the storm. Yet those ordinary relationships had to become practical very quickly. The fire needed attention. Food and water still had to be prepared. Children, older relatives, and anyone unwell required care. Animals waited beyond the walls. The entrance and route could not be allowed to disappear again. No household had an unlimited number of capable people. Every task given to one person removed that person from another task. The adult most familiar with livestock was often the natural choice for the barn. Knowledge mattered as much as strength. Someone who knew which cow had been eating poorly, which horse was nervous, or which latch tended to freeze could work faster and recognize danger earlier. Familiarity shortened exposure. But knowledge could be trapped in the wrong body. The person who understood the animals best might be older, injured, ill, or exhausted from clearing snow. A younger relative might have greater strength and less judgment. The household then had to choose between experience and physical capacity. Children's labour can be seen more clearly in Birdie MacDonald's memory of her South Dakota sod house. During stormy weather, her father and two older brothers took turns in a small sod annex, twisting coarse, slow grass into tight fuel. The grass had been cut and stacked the previous summer. They packed it into iron drums and fed it into the cooking stove because nearby wood was unavailable and purchased coal exceeded the family's finances. In warmer months, older children gathered buffalo chips for cooking fires. This household did not invent a tidy emergency plan when the snow arrived. Age, strength, knowledge, gender expectations, and poverty had already distributed the work. The father and older boys handled the difficult fuel. Younger children remained nearer the room and its safer tasks. The mother's labour continued around food, clothing, warmth, infants, and management of the interior. The account does not prove that every Plains family worked in the same way. It demonstrates why a storm was rarely survived by one heroic adult. The stove burned because summer labour, children's labour, and repeated winter attention had already been joined together. Farm children commonly carried real responsibilities before a blizzard arrived. They gathered fuel, fed chickens, carried water, watched younger siblings, worked in gardens, cleaned, cooked, and helped with animals according to age, place, and family need. Winter did not suddenly make them useful. It increased the importance of work they already knew. Small duties protected adult strength. A child brought fuel from an indoor pile to the stove, another held a lamp. Someone watched mittens near the heat without letting them scorch. An older child prepared a feed container, minded a pot, or helped fasten clothing before an adult went out. These actions saved minutes and movement. They also gave children a defined role during frightening confinement. Being told exactly what to do could reduce helplessness. Responsibility should not be confused with safety. A child capable in clear weather remained dangerously vulnerable in wind, cold, and poor visibility. Sending a child into a whiteout was not proof of admirable toughness. It could reflect necessity, absence of adults, poverty, misjudgment, or the severe demands of farm life. Some children completed difficult work and returned. Others did not. Indoors age changed the value of each task. Younger children stayed near the stove, where supervision itself became labour. A hot iron surface, open firebox, or pot of boiling water created dangers within the safest room. Keeping children occupied and away from those hazards allowed other work to continue. Older children could take over repetitive duties, kneading dough, peeling vegetables, refilling small containers, shaking snow from clothing, caring for a baby. These were not secondary contributions. Each one released an adult for work requiring greater strength or exposure. Women's labour often held the indoor system together, though no natural or universal division should be imagined. Cooking, preserving, washing, nursing, childcare, mending, fire tending, dairying and poultry work were frequently assigned to women in settler households. During a storm, those duties multiplied rather than paused. A woman might keep the stove drawing, ration food, melt snow, dry clothing, monitor children, and still help with animals or shoveling. The idea that one adult faced the blizzard while another remained safely indoors misunderstands the house. Indoor labour made the outdoor journey possible. Men were often expected to perform the heaviest work outside, clearing drifts, reaching barns, carrying feed, repairing structures, and checking livestock. Gender expectations did not guarantee presence or ability. A husband might be away when the storm arrived, injured, ill, or trapped in another building. Widows, single women, older daughters, and wives on isolated farms performed whatever work survival required. Weather respected no household role. It tested who was there. Hired workers added labour without removing questions of authority. An experienced hand might lead barn work or carry cooking and childcare. An inexperienced one needed supervision. Owners often decided who accepted the greatest risk, and dangerous assignments were not always freely or fairly distributed. Exhaustion made fairness harder. The person who had already dug out the door might still be the only one strong enough to reach the barn. The person who had slept least might know the stove best. Work could not always be rotated evenly because knowledge and necessity kept pulling the same people back to the same tasks. Fatigue reduced judgment. Cold hands tied poorer knots. A tired worker forgot a tool, left a latch unsecured, or stayed outside too long because returning empty-handed felt unacceptable. Rest, therefore, became maintenance of the human part of the system. One adult lay down while another watched the fire. Children were asked to keep voices low. A meal waited until the person returning from the barn had changed wet clothing. Rest was not idleness. It preserved tomorrow's labour. Neighbours, when reachable, widened the system. Plains households often depended on nearby people for labour, information, equipment, shelter, and help during illness or disaster. A blizzard could make a close neighbour effectively absent. Roads vanished. Horses could not be used safely. A chimney beyond the white did not create a safe route to it. After the wind weakened, neighbours might dig towards one another, check isolated homes, open roads, share feed, or carry news. Yet assistance depended on who had survived with enough strength and resources to offer it. Need did not disappear because everyone had need. Inside the farmhouse, work continued in small motions. One person held a rope while another checked its knot. A child placed dry mittens near the door. Someone filled a bowl before the next trip. Another listened for movement in the barn. Every result had a person behind it. Heat did not remain by itself. Water did not arrive by itself. Food did not become a meal by itself. Animals did not survive by themselves. And behind those people stood work completed before the storm, fuel stacked, food preserved, roofs repaired, hay stored, routes learned, and tools kept ready. The household could divide today's labour only because earlier labour had created something left to divide. Months before the door disappeared, winter had already begun in the form of decisions. A fence repaired before the ground froze. A roof patch completed before the first hard wind. Hay moved under cover. Wood cut while roads remained passable. Jars checked, sacks tied, and tools placed where cold hands could find them. None of these acts looked heroic. Most were tiring, repetitive, and easy to postpone. Yet the storm later gave each one a value that could not be created in a single afternoon. Preparation on the Great Plains was not one event called getting ready for winter. It was a season of converting summer and autumn into stored time. Fuel was one of the clearest examples. Wood had to be cut, split, dried, hauled, and stacked. Coal had to be bought and transported before roads became unreliable. Families using grass, corn cobs, dung, crop residue, or other local fuels needed to gather and protect enough material to keep it burnable. Damp fuel consumed effort, smoked badly, and produced less useful heat. A pile placed too far from the house could become almost theoretical once drifting snow erased the path. The best stack was dry, reachable, and divided sensibly. Most fuel remained outdoors where there was room. A smaller reserve stayed near the door or inside an attached space, ready for hours when going outside was unsafe. Kindling, matches, stove tools, and a container for ash belonged to the same system. The chimney also belonged to autumn. Soot, damage, loose joints, and poor draught did not wait politely for better weather. A stovepipe checked in mild conditions was safer than one inspected while smoke filled a snowbound room. Roof flashing, chimney caps, and the points where a flue passed through walls or ceilings required attention because fire and smoke could turn shelter into danger faster than cold. The house was red for weakness. Drafts around windows and doors could be reduced with fitted strips, cloth, paper, plaster, or other available material. Loose boards were secured, roofs were patched, hinges and latches were checked. A family might not possess ideal materials, but even small repairs changed how much fuel the house consumed. Winter preparation was energy management before anyone used that phrase. Every closed crack reduced the work demanded from the stove. Every sound roof protected, bedding, food, and dry clothing. Every usable latch preserved control over an opening. Food followed the same logic. The pantry represented months of labour compressed into quiet objects. Grain was harvested or purchased. Vegetables were lifted before frost damaged them. Fruit was dried, preserved, or stored when available. Meat was butchered and cured according to household practice. Beans and peas were dried. Fat was rendered. Salt, flour, coffee, sugar, and other goods were bought when money and transport allowed. Sequence mattered. Food had to be harvested at the right time, processed before spoilage, placed in containers, protected from pests, and checked through winter. A full cellar in October could become a poor one by January if rot spread unnoticed. A cracked jar, damp sack, or injured potato quietly consumed part of the reserve. Stored food was not finished food. It remained vulnerable to moisture, freezing, rodents, mold, and careless use. Seed grain might resemble food during hunger, while also representing the next crop. Livestock preparation carried an even longer chain of consequences. Hay had to be cut, dried, stacked, and protected. Grain or fodder was measured against the expected winter. Barns and sheds needed roofs, doors, bedding, and enough air movement. Watering equipment had to work in cold. Harness, ropes, gates, and feed bins required repair before frozen fingers made every job harder. A family could not manufacture a winter's hay after the storm began. Quantity alone did not settle the matter. Feed stored where drifting snow blocked access could become useless at the worst moment. Hay piled badly spoiled or created a fire risk. A roof carrying stored material needed to remain sound. The arrangement of barn, stack, well, and house shaped the labour required during severe weather. Farm layout was preparation made in wood, earth, and distance. So was tool placement. The shovel used at the door had to be inside or reachable. A second shovel in the barn could prevent one lost root from stopping all work. Ropes needed known locations. Lanterns required fuel and trimmed wicks. Buckets could not help if their handles were broken. An axe buried beneath other equipment might as well be across the county. Order became a survival resource because cold reduced patience. A person in a warm room could search for a missing tool. A person standing in blowing snow could not afford the same delay. Clothing also had to be treated as equipment. Coats were repaired, mittens were dried and mended, boots were checked. Spare layers mattered because one wet journey could remove the usefulness of the first set. Clothing that fitted badly or restricted movement created risk long before frostbite or exhaustion became obvious. Then there was weather knowledge. Families watched sky, wind, temperature, animal behaviour, and reports carried by neighbours, newspapers, telegraph, railway stations, or later forecasts. Access to formal warning systems changed over time and place, but people still made local judgments from signs they trusted. Changing wind, thickening cloud, unusual stillness, drifting loose snow, or a rapid temperature drop could prompt action. Animals were brought closer, water containers were filled, fuel came inside, chores were completed earlier, a trip to town was postponed. Weather signs could mislead. Forecasts failed to reach remote farms. A storm intensified faster than expected. Familiarity sometimes encouraged confidence when caution was needed. Observation still gave the household one advantage the blizzard later removed: time. An extra hour could mean animals fed, water drawn, children indoors, and the stove supplied. That hour might separate inconvenience from crisis. Preparation included memory as well as. After each winter, families learned where snow gathered, which window leaked, which path vanished first, which animals suffered most, and how quickly fuel disappeared during severe cold. The farm kept a record in practical habits. A rope moved closer to the door because it had once been needed. A stack was relocated because the old path drifted shut. A vent was raised. A second shovel was bought or made. This knowledge was not always written. It lived in repetition. By the time the family sat behind the buried door, much of its survival had already been decided by people working in warmer weather. They had not known the exact storm, drift, or hour when the barn would disappear. They had prepared for a range of trouble rather than one perfect emergency. Preparation did not guarantee safety. It created options. The stove could be fed without an immediate journey. A meal could be made without town. A rope could be found in the dark. The animals had something to eat. The roof had already been repaired. The entrance remained blocked, but choices remained behind it. Those choices revealed the next hard truth. Not every family entered winter with the same tools, stores, labour, money, health, or margin for error. The storm crossed the plains without preference, but its consequences were never equal. Two farmhouses could stand beneath the same sky and face different winters. One family possessed a sound roof, deep fuel pile, healthy horses, stored hay, working well, several older children, and neighbours nearby. Another occupied a thin claim shack with one adult ill, little cash, weak livestock, damp fuel, and food already running low. Snow covered both doors. It did not create the same emergency. Poverty narrowed every choice before the first drift formed. Money bought coal, lumber, stove parts, warm clothing, preserved food, medicine, and replacement tools. It allowed labour to be hired for harvesting, repairs, or livestock care. A larger reserve could be kept because the household first possessed something to reserve. A poorer family might prepare just as seriously and still enter winter with less. There was no moral failure in an empty fuel box after a bad harvest. Discipline could not turn crop loss into flour or make coal affordable when transport charges were high. Careful people could be trapped by debt, illness, drought, animal disease, low prices, or the cost of establishing a farm where almost everything had to be built. Even the category homesteader can conceal failure. National Park Service summaries estimate that only about 40% of claimants eventually completed the requirements and secured ownership of their claims. Many others left after weather, poor soil, isolation, inadequate water, debt, or insufficient capital defeated the promise implied by free land. The opportunity itself had not appeared on empty country. Homestead expansion depended on land taken from indigenous nations and on policies that restricted indigenous movement, economies, and control of their territories. The storm therefore entered a landscape already organized by property, displacement, race, citizenship, credit, transport, and unequal access to help. Preparation still mattered. It could not erase the conditions deciding who had enough to prepare. Housing made the inequality visible. A well-built farmhouse might offer alternate doors, glazed windows, reliable hardware, and a cellar close enough to remain useful. A claim shack could have one entrance, thin walls, poor fittings, and no safe route above a drift. A sod house conserved heat while still suffering from moisture, limited openings, roof weakness, or poor drainage. The difference was not comfort alone. It was the number of failures a household could survive at once. A strong house lost one window and remained secure. A weak house might depend on that window for light and escape. A prosperous family closed unused rooms. A family already crowded into one room had nowhere farther to retreat. Fuel followed the same pattern. One farm held seasoned wood under cover and coal near the stove. Another depended on grass, cobs, dung, or what could be gathered because purchased fuel was beyond reach. Such fuels could work, but some demanded more frequent feeding, more labour, or greater storage for the same lasting heat. When several capable people were present, constant stove tending might be possible. When one adult was ill, nursing an infant, or exhausted, a demanding fuel supply asked for labour the household did not have. Health changed the meaning of every task. An injured leg prevented safe digging. Fever increased the need for warmth and water while reducing the labour available to obtain both. Pregnancy, recent childbirth, chronic illness, disability, age, and malnutrition changed what could reasonably be asked of each person. Historical records often treat a family as one capable unit. Real households contain bodies with different limits. An older person might know the farm best and be unable to reach the barn. A child carried feed but could not resist the wind. A woman recovering from childbirth might remain responsible for cooking, nursing, and other work while needing care herself. Disability did not remove a person from family life, it changed how labour had to be arranged. Isolation also had degrees. A neighbour visible in clear weather might help after a storm. Another household stood far from the nearest road, town, railway, doctor, or store. Distance affected how warnings arrived, whether supplies could be purchased, and how soon help came afterwards. New settlers often possessed less local knowledge than established families. They did not yet know where drifts formed, which route stayed visible, how long fuel lasted, or which neighbour owned useful equipment. Experience accumulated slowly and sometimes through costly mistakes. Culture and language shaped access too. Immigrant families brought practical knowledge, food traditions, building methods, and networks of mutual assistance. Limited English, prejudice, unfamiliar laws, and exclusion from local institutions could make warnings, credit, medical care, or public help harder to obtain. Indigenous peoples of the plains possessed generations of environmental knowledge, seasonal movement, clothing, shelter, food systems, and social organization adapted to the region. Settler expansion violently restricted land access, damaged bison-based economies, imposed reservation systems, and disrupted mobility and subsistence. Their winter hardship cannot be treated as a colourful variation of homesteading. It was shaped by dispossession and government policy, as well as weather. Tenant families and hired workers faced limits owners did not. A tenant repaired only what the lease, landlord, money, and materials allowed. A hired worker might sleep in a bunkhouse or barn apart from the main family, becoming isolated when snow cut buildings off from one another. Domestic workers carried essential labour while having little authority over supplies or decisions. Ownership provided control. It did not always provide wealth, but lack of ownership could reduce both. Gender expectations created another unequal burden. Men were often assigned the most visible outdoor risks. Women frequently carried continuous indoor labour around fuel, cooking, water, clothing, children, illness, and food preservation, while also helping outside when necessary. One kind of work appeared in dramatic stories, the other often disappeared because it happened beside the stove. Both could be dangerous. A man crossing the yard could be lost in a whiteout. A woman indoors might spend hours breathing smoke from a pale flue while caring for children and keeping the fire alive. A household could survive the barn journey and still suffer from exhaustion, burns, infection, or bad air. Even food stores reflected power. Adults reduced their portions for children. Hired workers might receive different food from owners. Women serving meals could hide their own hunger. A family preserved seed grain while eating less because consuming it threatened the next planting. Rationing was never only arithmetic. It was a decision about whose body would carry the shortage. Community was not automatically just either. Relief and rescue could overlook remote families, poor districts, indigenous communities, immigrants, and people without strong social connections. The household behind the buried door survived within a larger arrangement of land, money, labour, law, kinship, and reputation. Preparation remained important, but preparation was not a fair contest. A well-supplied family used planning to protect abundance. A family with almost nothing used knowledge, restraint, reuse, and labour to stretch a narrow margin. Both adapted. Only one could absorb a broken stove, a sick horse, and another 3 days of wind. By late evening, the difference between inconvenience and danger could be heard inside the room. The fuel pile was lower. The strongest worker moved more slowly. One child had begun to cough. The walls still protected them, but shelter was no longer a simple answer. A house holding warmth could also hold smoke. A roof keeping out the storm could carry an unseen load. A door protecting the room could prevent escape. The refuge now had to be watched as carefully as the weather outside. A house could protect life and still create danger. The contradiction was easy to miss because shelter felt like the answer to everything beyond the walls. Wind could not strike the body directly. Snow could not cover sleeping children. The stove still burned. Food remained on the shelf. Yet the same walls holding warmth also held whatever the fire produced. The roof blocking snow carried its weight. The closed door keeping out the storm limited escape. The small room allowing the family to heat less space placed more people, damp clothing, flame, smoke, and fatigue close together. The first warning might appear in the stove. A fire that had drawn cleanly began to behave differently. Smoke entered when the door was opened. The flame became dull. Soot gathered where it had not gathered before. Wind around the chimney disturbed the draft, while snow or ice near the outlet made the problem worse. Poor fuel could be blamed first. Damp wood smoked. Grass, cobs, dung, and other substitutes demanded close attention. Ash building beneath the fire reduced airflow. A damper in the wrong position changed the burn. Any of these could explain a smoky room. The household could not afford to assume. The stovepipe was inspected as far as safety allowed. Someone listened near the chimney. A door or window might be opened slightly to see whether fresh air improved the draft. If it did, the room had become too tightly closed for the fire to breathe properly. That exchange was bitter. Opening the house wasted heat. Keeping it closed could trap smoke and combustion gases. Smoke offered visible discomfort. Eyes watered. Throats tightened. A coughing child coughed more. Carbon monoxide offered no reliable smell or colour. Without modern alarms, headache, weakness, dizziness or confusion could be mistaken for hunger, cold, illness or exhaustion. The safest response was not endurance for its own sake. It was air, a small opening, reduced fire, cleared flue where possible, and movement away from the smoky area could matter more than preserving every degree of warmth. After days of defending the heated room, the household might need to surrender some heat to keep that room safe. The roof carried a quieter threat. Snow did not settle evenly. Wind scoured one slope and loaded another. Drifts gathered behind ridges, against higher walls, or where one roof joined another. A porch, lean-to, or addition could carry a different burden from the main structure. The danger was documented in more than creaking timber. During the 1966 North Dakota blizzard, Sebastian Crumb's house was buried to the rooftop. When the roof began to crack, he used household furniture as temporary bracing. His car outside was crushed beneath the weight. Earlier Plains accounts show the same contradiction in rougher buildings. After Nebraska's Easter blizzard of 1873, Lucy Barger remembered that the family's small barn had disappeared beneath snow and that two sides of their house were entirely covered. A neighbour whose shed collapsed brought his horse into the family's one-room sod house. The animal, people, stove, lamp, bedding and food were suddenly sharing the same limited shelter. The scene sounds almost comic until its mechanism becomes clear. A failed outbuilding did not remove the need to protect the horse. It transferred that need into the human room. Shelter had not failed completely. It had become more crowded, wetter, less ventilated, and harder to manage. Most families did not calculate roof loads with instruments. They watched and listened. A beam made a sound unlike ordinary settling. A door began to bind because its frame had shifted. Plaster, earth, dust, or small fragments fell from above. The roof line appeared to sag. In a sod house or dugout, dampness and age could already have weakened roof material. In timber buildings, poor construction, decay, or a badly supported addition narrowed the margin. Heavy drifting snow did not need to crush the whole house. A partial failure over a porch, shed, or passage could block an exit, damage fuel, or expose part of the structure. Clearing a roof during active wind was dangerous. A person climbing into the open-faced ice, hidden edges, unstable snow, and stronger gusts, removing snow unevenly could change the load suddenly. The family had to decide whether the signs justified that risk. Water created another structural problem indoors. Snow carried through the doorway melted across the floor. Wet clothing released moisture beside the stove. Cooking and snow melting filled the air with steam. Moisture condensed on cold surfaces, froze at window edges, soaked bedding near walls, and made already cold spaces more hostile. Dampness reduced the value of clothing and bedding. A blanket merely clammy in the afternoon could become a serious problem overnight. Boots softened near heat and stiffened again when moved away. Mittens not fully dried looked ready until they were needed outdoors. Separating wet from dry required attention the household was beginning to lose. Fatigue entered through repetition. Feed the stove. Check the child. Melt snow. Prepare food. Clear the threshold. Reach the barn. Return. Dry clothing. Begin again. The strongest worker moved more slowly because strength was not fixed. Sleep had been broken by wind, coughing, fire tending, and worry. Meals were smaller. The body spent energy in cold air and then spent more warming itself again. Exhaustion turned familiar tasks into hazards. A stove lid remained slightly out of place. A lamp passed too close to hanging cloth. A shovel was left outdoors. Her barn latch did not fully catch. A person stepped beyond the rope because the wall seemed near. None of these mistakes required stupidity. They required only a tired human being inside a system with no spare labour. The room also pressed on the mind. Buried windows reduced daylight. Wind kept speaking through the walls. No one could see whether the storm was worsening or merely sounding worse. Each person carried a different fear. The animals, roof, fuel, missing road, or coughing child. Fear sometimes produced unnecessary movement. Someone wanted to check outside again. Another opened a door before preparing. A sound from the barn became an argument. More fuel was added because the room felt frighteningly cold, even when its temperature remained survivable. Calm meant giving fear a task small enough to manage. Count the fuel. Measure the water. Listen to the stove. Observe the roof from the safest place. Rest one person while another remains awake. Keep clothing, rope, and tools ready in case leaving becomes necessary. The household had survived by making the house smaller, warmer, and more controlled. Now survival depended on preventing that control from becoming confinement. Then, after another long interval of listening, the sound outside changed. The wind did not stop at once. It lost an edge. Walls trembled less often. Fine snow no longer hissed so steadily against the glass. The chimney drew with fewer interruptions. In the barn, animals settled into quieter movement. No one celebrated. The door was opened carefully, and the family looked at what the storm had left them to repair. The first change was light. Not bright sunlight, perhaps, but a pale opening beyond the threshold where moving white had begun to settle. The yard still lacked its familiar shape. Drifts leaned against walls, filled hollows, covered steps, and joined buildings to the ground with long slopes of packed snow. The farm returned to view only in fragments. No one stepped out immediately. The wind had weakened, but cold remained. Loose snow still travelled near the surface. A roof might release a burden without warning. A drift cut from one side could collapse into a new path. Days of confinement had taught the difference between possibility and safety. Inspection began from shelter. The chimney was watched. The roofline was studied. Eyes searched for the barn door, fence posts, well, and any movement where animals were kept. The usable doorway had to be widened gradually. Snow was moved far enough away that it would not slide back against the boards. A narrow trench served one person, but not someone carrying feed, water, or an injured animal. The whole yard did not need restoration at once. What mattered was a small network of dependable routes. House to fuel. House to barn. House to water. Later. House to road and neighbour. Each path was a connection made visible again. Soft powder near the surface could conceal harder layers beneath. Wind-packed sections resisted the shovel like pale earth. Crust formed where temperature and moving particles changed the snow. A worker expecting every section to behave alike could lose balance or spend strength too quickly. Clearing followed the restraint used indoors. Enough for movement. Enough for air. Enough to reach the next necessary place. The roof demanded attention without impatience. From the ground, people looked for sagging, broken edges, displaced material, or a heavy drift where roof surfaces met. Porches, lean-tos, sheds, and additions might show strain before the main structure. A small failure could block a door, crush tools, or expose feed. Going onto an icy roof remained dangerous after the wind weakened. The safest response depended on the building, load, and signs of damage. No single brave gesture solved every roof. The barn came next, because the animals had already waited long enough. The route followed by rope was partly visible. Fence posts emerged as short, dark marks. The barn wall stood beyond a drift whose shape had not existed 2 days earlier. Inside, air was heavy with warmth, moisture, bedding, and animals. The first relief was movement. A horse turned its head. A cow stood when approached. Chickens shifted along the roost. Survival, however, was not the same as being unharmed. An animal could be weak from cold, thirst, poor ventilation, or interrupted feeding. Damp bedding chilled legs and bodies. Snow driven through cracks melted and refroze. A frightened animal might injure itself against a stall or tether. Feed could be wet or buried. A water container might be empty because it had frozen, spilled, or been consumed sooner than expected. Inspection moved slowly enough to notice these things. Water was offered. Feed was restored. Bedding was shifted or replaced where possible. Openings were cleared enough to improve air without exposing animals to unnecessary wind. Any animal unable to rise, refusing water, breathing strangely, or showing injury required help the household might not provide alone. Here the storm's hidden losses appeared. A bird could be found beneath others. A small animal might have died in the coldest corner. A cow could survive and lose condition badly. A horse might stand and remain too weak for immediate work. Discovery came after the danger, in quieter air, when endurance had a cost that could finally be seen. Fences had to be found before animals were released. A gate might stand open beneath the snow. Wire could be pressed down by a drift. Turning stock into an uncertain yard risked creating another emergency. The well and pump needed inspection too. Snow around the opening had to be cleared without pushing dirty material into the source. Covers, handles, ropes, and buckets were checked. If the household had depended on melted snow, reliable well water immediately reduced pressure on stove and fuel. Yet milder weather could bring a new problem. Snow piled against walls and roofs eventually became water. Frozen ground and blocked drainage could direct melt towards foundations, dugouts, cellars, wells, and low outbuildings. A house surviving the cold phase might face dampness, leaks, or contaminated water during the thaw. No household repaired all of this in one day. Recovery had an order. Protect people and animals. Preserve water and heat. Open essential routes. Identify structural danger. Then extend the circle outward. The road remained buried beyond the farmyard. Wheel tracks no longer existed. Drifts crossed the old line at angles. Even beneath a clear sky, travel could remain impossible until neighbours, teams, later machinery, or public crews reopened a route. Contact with neighbours began only when conditions allowed. A person followed a fence, road edge, or other fixed guide. The purpose was to learn who needed help and who could provide it. One house had fuel and little food. Another had a sick child. A third had lost livestock but owned a strong team. Someone possessed a sound shovel, spare rope, or usable sled. Someone had not been seen since before the storm. Community returned as a chain of practical questions. Is everyone alive? Can the entrance be opened? Do they have heat? Are the animals standing? Does anyone need medical help? Neighbours dug entrances, cleared chimneys, carried water, shared feed, and opened paths. They also carried news: a blocked road farther east, a roof down near the creek, a family sheltered in another building, livestock found against a fence, or a traveller still missing. The scale of the storm became visible through these exchanges. What had felt like one household's private confinement belonged to a much wider interruption. Help remained limited. Every neighbour had a roof, animals, fuel, an exhausted body of their own. Assistance was practical and often brief because need exceeded spare labour. Mutual aid did not erase inequality. It redistributed what little margin remained. By evening, the farmhouse had begun to resemble itself again. A path reached the barn. The chimney drew cleanly. Fresh water stood beside the stove. Wet clothing hung where it could dry. The door opened without striking a wall of snow. The familiar view was altered. Trenches replaced paths. The fence appeared and vanished. The barn carried the smell of strain and survival. The farm had not simply returned to normal. It had to be rebuilt into normal. One route and one task at a time. At the doorway, someone paused before closing it for the night. For days it had been a barrier, a risk, and a measure of everything the household could not reach. Now it opened onto work, damage, neighbours, animals, and the first signs of recovery. The snow remained. What had changed was the meaning of the opening. For days, the doorway had been a hard, white boundary. It marked the place where the household ended and uncertainty began. Behind it lay warmth, smoke, food, fatigue, and shared work. Beyond it stood the barn, well, fuel pile, road, and every danger the storm had hidden. Now the door moved freely. Cold air entered, but no wall of snow followed. The threshold was visible again. A narrow trench led into the yard, its sides cut through layers pressed together by wind. Footprints crossed and recrossed the path. Near the barn, darker marks showed where hay, water, and bedding had been carried. The farm had not defeated winter. It had resumed functioning inside it. That distinction explains how Great Plains families survived when snow covered the door. They did not depend on one universal trick. They did not all climb through attics, dig tunnels, tie the same kind of rope, or wait beside perfectly stocked stoves. Their houses, resources, cultures, bodies and storms differed too widely for one answer. The strongest supported answer is quieter. Families survived when the buried entrance did not become the first failure in a longer chain. A door could be cleared because a shovel was reachable. The person clearing it could return because the route was known or physically marked. The stove continued because fuel had been gathered and kept dry. The room remained usable because smoke still had a way out. Water could be drawn, protected, or made at a cost the fuel supply could bear. Food lasted because it had been stored, preserved, and used carefully. Animals endured because someone had prepared feed, shelter, bedding, and a route to reach them. No single part saved the family. The parts kept one another alive. That is why the blocked door mattered so much. It made the household's hidden connections visible. In ordinary weather, the yard seemed open and simple. The well was only a well. The barn was only a barn. The fuel pile was only a pile of wood, coal, grass, cobs, or other burnable material. During the storm, distance changed every object. A few meters became exposure. A missing path became disorientation. A wet mitten became lost labor. A poorly placed stack became inaccessible heat. A blocked vent became bad air. The door collected these problems at one point. It showed whether the household still possessed choices. Some families did, others had almost none. A sound farmhouse, healthy workers, nearby neighbours, stored food, good animals, and money for fuel created a wide margin. A weak shack, poor harvest, illness, debt, little clothing, and distant help created a narrow one. Both households might work with equal discipline. Only one could absorb several failures without entering immediate danger. Survival should not become proof that hardship automatically made people stronger. Hardship also injured, exhausted, isolated, and killed. Preparation improved the odds. But preparation depended partly on access to land, money, tools, labour, knowledge, transport, and time. Community helped, but community could be distant, overburdened, or unequal. Experience mattered, yet new settlers and displaced communities often faced winter within systems they had not freely chosen. The family standing at the reopened door did not need this argument explained. It could be seen in the yard. The repaired path existed because someone had enough strength to dig. The animals stood because feed remained available. The chimney drew because the flue had not failed. The water vessel was full because the well or stored supply remained usable. Each success had another condition behind it, and each condition had required work, often completed months before anyone knew which storm would test it. Autumn returned in small objects. The handle of the shovel worn smooth by earlier use. The rope coiled near the door. The patched seam around a window. Dry fuel carried indoors before the weather closed. The jar whose contents became supper. Hay cut beneath a summer sky and carried now through a trench of snow. Winter survival was built from delayed consequences. People who gathered, repaired, stored, watched, remembered, and rationed created protection across time. They moved warmth from autumn into January. They moved food from harvest into isolation. They moved local knowledge from one storm into the next. The household also belonged to a larger winter system. Rail lines brought coal, flour, tools, and news until drift stopped them. Town stores extended farm reserves until roads disappeared. Neighbours supplied labour and information until visibility erased the space between homes. Local government, railway crews, doctors, and relief efforts mattered after severe storms, but they could not reach every isolated family quickly. The private struggle behind one door was connected to transport, markets, settlement patterns, land policy, and community networks. A household appeared self-reliant only while those wider systems remained invisible. The storm made their absence visible too. Even the house carried memory. A doorway might later be altered because this one had drifted shut. Fuel could be stacked on another side. A rope might remain fixed between buildings. The second shovel could stay in the barn. A vent could be raised, or a weak roof strengthened. The farm learned by changing its arrangement. Memory could not make the plains gentle. Another storm might arrive from a different direction. A longer winter could exhaust larger stores. Illness could remove the strongest worker. A family that survived once was not promised the same outcome again. The limits remain part of the answer. There was no complete mastery here. Only better preparation, better judgment, and a wider margin. By evening, the door was closed again. This time it moved without resistance. The stove burned lower because the fiercest cold had passed. Clothing dried slowly. The animals had water and feed. A neighbour's condition was known. Damage had been identified, and some of it could wait until morning. Without the constant wind, small domestic sounds returned. A spoon touched a bowl. A chair shifted. One piece of fuel was placed in the stove, not three. The fire settled around it. The doorway stood nearby. Ordinary once more. But it no longer meant only entrance and exit. It held the whole story of the farm. When snow covered it, the family survived not because the door was stronger than the storm, but because life behind it had been organized so that one buried opening did not end every connection at once. The house held heat, the stores held time, the roots held direction. The people held the system together. Outside, moonlight rested on the drift that had once sealed the threshold. Its surface was smooth except for the narrow path cut through it. In the morning, that path would need clearing again. For tonight, the door could open.